Civil wars ignite when elites fracture. This is a quote from the leading expert on civil wars and is true in nearly every case. In England, it was the court versus the parliament. In America, it was the factory elites versus the farming elites. And in France, it was the royal elites versus the professional class. But what happens when the elites are united, but the masses are divided? Well, in most cases, things fizzle out. But in 1931, Australia looks set to be the exception to the rule. In fact, the elite was so unified in their attempt to stop a workers' government that the Conservative opposition leader went to a Labor minister and told him that if he defected, he could lead the opposition under a new name. That party would be called the United Australia Party. Lyons took that deal and he called for a vote of no confidence against his old government. In a state of panic, the Prime Minister turned to someone who hated Lyons more than anyone else. He was the Premier of New South Wales, and his name was Jack Lang. Surely he'd help him fight the rat. But the Prime Minister was mistaken. Have a look at this. Jack Lang had control of 5 people that were once in the Labor government. He felt that his guys had a much better chance in beating Lyons, and so he actually joined Lyons in calling a vote of no confidence in Labor. That was the last time that Lang ever sided with Lyons. That was because just 6 months later, Lyons was preparing the Australian Army to invade Sydney and fight a police force that was loyal to Jack Lang. So, how on earth did it come to this?
The Prime Minister has issued Jack Lang a dire warning.
The army has been put on high alert with a possible invasion of Sydney.
So, if you time travel to 1929 and said to someone from, like, Cronulla, hey, the party that you voted for is gonna eat itself apart in 2 years' time, there is just no way they would have believed you. The Conservative Party had lost nearly half of their seats, including the Prime Minister's Stanley Bruce. But for Labor, it was their first time in power since World War I. Their leader, James Scullin, had to patiently bide his time. In 1921, Labor had committed to buying out big businesses and evenly sharing the profits across the nation. Scullin was ready to rip in, but literally 2 days after he was elected, this happened.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
If you don't know anything about the Great Depression, Americans wanted to buy stocks because their graph line looked pretty sexy. This caused other Americans to want to buy in, which drove the price up further. Now, if you had bought in back here, your stocks had since tripled in value, so everyone, whether rich or poor, wanted to get in on the graph. Those who couldn't afford stocks took out loans from the bank, and it just skyrocketed from here. If you don't know anything about economics, this is what we call a bubble, where the price of something is overinflated and is perceived to be more valuable than what it actually is. If confidence is the only thing that is driving up the price, then a lack of confidence can cause it to come crashing down. And that's exactly what happened on October the 24th. When the line started to dip, people panicked and they sold their shares, which caused a vicious downward spiral, and Americans lost their money. Now, to be honest, Scullin's initial reaction was good. The bubble needed to pop. What Scullin didn't know was that so many Americans had used bank loans to fund their investments, and now they couldn't repay the bank. In other words, banks closed down, which meant that businesses lost their savings and their ability to get loans. They then started firing people, and I'm sure you can see the disastrous spiral that happened from there. 30% of Americans couldn't get a job, which meant that they weren't buying our stuff anymore. But for Australia, that wasn't even the bad bit. For the previous decade, the Conservatives hadn't really been all that conservative with their money. They spent huge sums of money helping British migrants settle on Australian farms, but this was much more than what we were making back in tax. And rather than give up on the idea, Stanley Bruce made us borrow more and more and more. He was really just like, please London, give me all the money. So as we got to the end of the 1920s, Britain was pretty concerned. They sent out a guy called Otto Niemeyer to look at our banks, and verbatim, he said, how is Australia going to pay her way if this process continues? So when the Depression happened and the British banks got hit, who was the first customer that they were going to drop? Of course, it was going to be us. To put it into perspective, 2 days after Scullin came in, a storm that was completely out of his control meant that he had no access to money, new farmers who had to cut off money to, and an unemployment rate that was reaching the high 20s. Bro really got stitched up so hard. But Crisis Management 101. Focus on what you can control rather than what you can't. And so Scullon's solution was to inject money and to target unemployment. The theory was that if the government paid Old MacDonald an unusually high amount for his wheat, that would not only incentivize him to grow more, but would then give him play money. He could then use that money to buy a tractor, which would give the tractor company business, and then that money could ripple throughout the economy. This is called stimulus. And during the Depression, an economist called John Maynard Keynes started to gain notoriety for saying that this was the best approach to handle the crisis. But this actually flew in the face of conventional wisdom, which said that government should cut spending to avoid inflation, which would then keep investors confident in the country's economy. That approach is now just considered so laughable that during the GFC, nearly every government except for David Cameron's injected huge sums of money. But Scullon's treasurer was a huge fan of Keynes when he was still something of an indie underground economist, and so Scullon was willing to give it a go. He publicly announced that the government would pay farmers 4 cents per bushel for their wheat, which was way above market value. So the farmers got planting. But once again, he got completely stitched up. There was a bit of a weird quirk in the 1929 election. There had actually been an election just a year earlier where Stanley Bruce vowed to get rid of the Workers' Court that ruled on things like minimum wage and basic working conditions. But this election only gave Bruce a slim majority in Parliament. One of his teammates was this guy, Billy Hughes. He was a Labour Prime Minister during World War I, but he defected to the Conservatives. Hughes more or less said that you can take the boy out of Labour, but you can't take Labour out of the boy, and he refused to abolish the court. This meant that just a year later, Bruce called yet another election hoping to get that mega majority, but this was only for the lower house. So even though Labour smashed Bruce in the 1929 election, the Senate stayed unchanged from 1928 and never went to an election. This was what the Senate looked like. So just about every time Scullon proposed a solution, his bill would be met with a 2-letter response. No. Bro simply couldn't catch a break, and you're not going to believe this, but he got stitched up even harder. Remember that British dude that was sent to inspect our banks, Otto Niemeyer? Well, he scolded Scullon for even thinking of injecting money. According to our Supreme Wise Overlord, spare money should go towards repaying that massive debt and not towards fighting unemployment. In other words, Britain was saying, where's my money? But what if you just didn't repay it?
The Premier of New South Wales abandons his duty.
For the second time, Jack Lang has decided to default on our debt to His Majesty the King.
So during the Depression, the Premier of New South Wales was this guy, Jack Lang. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet was that our debt wasn't just to support the migrant farmers. It was also for Britain lending us equipment in World War I. So Lang was like, let me get this straight. We fought a war for you against your enemies, and so in the world's worst economic crisis, you're saying pay up now. Lang was livid, especially because he'd promised his state that his government would spend huge amounts of money to get them out of unemployment. Like, this was a big spanner in the works. So throughout 1930 and 1931, there were meetings between the premiers and the Prime Minister. They agreed to a plan called the Premier's Plan, where each state would reduce their spending and instead offer up money to repay that debt to Britain. However, there was one who always objected to this, Jack Lang. In fact, when New South Wales refused to pay, Scullon had to bail them out using federal money, which caused the other premiers to hate Lang. But at those meetings, there was another who butted heads with Scullon, his stand-in treasurer, Joey Lyons.
He is nothing but a rat. These are the cries of the Labour Party faithful as one of their most prominent ministers defects away.
So there were a number of big dogs within the Labour Party. One was the former Premier of Queensland, Ted Theodore, and yes, that was his name, but the other was the former Premier of Tasmania, Joey Lyons. Initially, it was Theodore who was treasurer, but in 1930, he was forced to stand aside over an impending investigation into his government buying a mine that he himself was alleged to be a secret owner of. In his absence, Lyons became the treasurer. So having two former premiers at your disposal meant that a lot of egos had to be managed. Theodore and Lyons both agreed that at least some money needed to go back to Britain. But whereas Lyons believed that all of it should go to Britain, Ted believed that some should be kept and put into stimulus. At the other extreme, Lang believed that it should all go to stimulus. But when Queensland dropped charges against Theodore, most of Labour agreed that he should return as treasurer. However, Lyons hated this decision and argued that Theodore actually had to be cleared before he could return. In his anger, he resigned from cabinet and then defected to the Conservative Party, who shared Lyons' belief that all spare money needed to go to paying off Britain. 4 other Labour members joined him, and this meant that Scullin now just had 42 out of 75 seats. If 5 more defected, he lost his government. With Scullin's government hanging on by the finest of threads, even just the smallest crack could ruin him. But then came the news that was, to put it mildly, not the best. When a Sydney MP called John West died, Labor was forced to contest a by-election to retain the seat. Given that the seat was in Sydney, the New South Wales branch got to select a candidate, and they chose a guy called Eddie Ward. His campaign was filled with Lang's talking points, vowing to provide stimulus and criticising any plans to pay off the war debt. Now, I'm sure that you could imagine how Scullin would react to that. Federal Labor was like, bro, you are going for a federal seat, like here's a strategy, right? Have you considered maybe not undermining your own party in the campaign? Scullin threatened the expulsion of New South Wales Labor from the national network. New South Wales Labor then expelled Ted Theodore, and when Eddie Ward won the seat, he wasn't allowed to participate in policy meetings. This last one was the nail in the coffin. In the same month that Lyons defected, Ward and 4 other Lang allies deserted Labor to form their own party that was commonly known as Lang Labor. Not culty at all, right? So Lyons felt that this was his chance. If Lang supporters joined him, they could call for a vote of no confidence in Scullin. Initially, Lang Labor refused, agreeing to still support the government. However, as Lang became more and more frustrated that Scullin was going ahead with repaying Britain, and as he felt that Queensland farmers were being favoured with the small amount of relief that they could get through the Senate, he decided to join Lyons. In November of 1931, the Scullin government was toppled, and new elections would determine who would govern Australia in 1932. Lyons was confident that the Conservatives would get close enough to a majority that they could team up with the Country Party. Lang was confident that Lang Labor could get enough seats in New South Wales to bully the Federal Labor Party into backing down and abandoning debt repayments. He horribly miscalculated. Rather than making gains, Lang Labor lost a seat, and they did so much damage to Scullin that Federal Labor lost 21 seats. On the other hand, Lyons had gained so many seats that he didn't even need the Country Party to form a coalition with. Yet even then, the powerless Country Party still had more seats than Labor. Lang had played a vital role in giving Canberra to the enemy.
The only real choice the people had to make was for sound, sane finance and government, as against plans for currency inflation and political control of currency and credit.
If you want to do a deep dive on the Labor splits, our online classroom can take you from having a basic knowledge to being elite. You'd definitely be able to brief sitting Labor politicians on both the 1932 and the 1955 split. If in the first month you feel otherwise, we'll refund you, no questions asked. The link to apply is below, and unless I'm sleeping, I get back to you within a couple of hours. But in 1932, the old issue had gotten worse. Over here in Sydney, Lang was like, we're not paying a dime of interest to the British. But down here in Canberra, Lyons was ardent that his new regime wasn't going to bail out Lang like Scullin had. And this is where we start to see the standoff. Lyons introduced something called the Financial Agreement Enforcement Act. It was a fancy name for a law that made it illegal for Lang to not repay the debt, and it required money to be surrendered immediately. Lang took Lyons to the High Court, appealing to British anti-slavery laws. His point was that now with no money to spend, he could no longer pay state government employees. The High Court wasn't persuaded and ordered for payments to be made to Canberra immediately. So surely the game was over then, right? Well, no. Lang kept resisting. He issued an order to state government workers to ignore the verdict and to make no payments. Legend even has it that he moved the cash out of the Treasury and into Sydney Trades Hall, where it could be protected by the New South Wales Police. This was big. This was really only one step away from Lang calling us the Confederacy of New South Wales. Unfortunately for Lang, there was a mole. An accountant by the name of Robert Beardsmore leaked the order to the person that mattered, the governor. Like the Governor-General, a governor of a state was the king's representative in government and actually had the power to fire the leader. When Lang gave his controversial orders to resist Canberra, he felt as though the New South Wales governor, Philip Game, best not know about it. However, when Game got hold of this, he felt that Lyons had to know, and the army was placed on high alert. I mean, there was a very real chance that they'd have to forcefully seize the money. While the army made preparations, Game scheduled an emergency meeting with Lang, demanding that he retract his order. Lang still refused. Remember, Game could fire Lang at any point, so this was an incredibly ballsy move. But Lang was very conscious of one thing. The New South Wales police were extremely loyal to him. This was because Lang had given them powers to crush a group of 80,000 thugs called the New Guard. These thugs weren't just mildly right-wing, they were full-blown fascists that were really cheering on one particular party in the 1932 German elections. The New Guard called for street violence and even assaulted one of Lang's allies in the party. So the New South Wales police told Lang that they would back him to the hill against the New Guard. This meant that if Game made a move against him, he could easily have him arrested. The implications of this were huge. Arresting Game would mean overthrowing an entire legal system, which in that case you may as well just declare independence. If Lang did this, there was no going back. Lyons would certainly deploy the army, and it'd be guerrilla warfare in Sydney. So Lang had to have control of the escalation ladder. The army and police had similar numbers, which meant that Lang could likely protract the war for at least some time, and they'd probably be far from an instant walkover. But Lang wasn't surrounded with generals and didn't have time to run war scenarios. A police commissioner wouldn't have the faintest idea of how they'd go taking on the might of a national army. But Lang wasn't given the luxury of time, possibly save the nation. He later wrote that he was really considering arresting the governor, but decided the payoff of civil war wasn't worth just not paying interest. In May of 1932, Game fired Lang and ordered the New South Wales United Australia Party to form a government until new elections could be held. And if you think that Lang was just some loose cannon from New South Wales, then think again. He had a bloody cult following. Upon hearing of his sacking, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Sydney to protest. Sydney had only just over 1 million people living in it at the time, and that level of cult worship was matched within the party. When New South Wales Labor split from the mother party, no one called them by their technical name, which was Labor New South Wales. Instead, everyone called them Lang Labor. In the 1960s, when a young Labor prodigy called Paul Keating wanted a mentor, who did he choose? Jack Lang. And like Keating himself said, I will always have tremendous respect for Jack Lang for the moral clarity that he had in leadership. He gave widows a pension when no one else would, introduced same work, same pay laws for both genders as early as 1926, made high school completely free, stopped landlords from being able to evict tenants on a whim. On 2 attempts, he tried to get the unelected, obstructionist, and for at least part of his time exclusively male upper house to vote itself out of existence. You are not going to find many bigger fans of Jack Lang than me. But have a look at the 1932 New South Wales election. Lang lost 31 out of 55 seats, and his party was reduced to rubble. For the rest of the 1930s, the United Australia Party held both Canberra and Sydney. Despite having, at least in my opinion, the best economic solutions for combating the Depression, Lang's political instincts made sure that none of them were implemented for the rest of the 1930s. Across the world, very few governments believed that John Maynard Keynes had a point when he said that during a crisis, a government should inject money rather than cut money. Australia's government was one of those rare few. But because Theodore opted for a moderated approach, Lang let perfect be the enemy of good and imploded the very vehicle that was advancing the country. Instead, we got UAP governments who refused to inject money, cut wages, and hiked up taxes to try and take money out of circulation.
These people may rest assured that Australia will now carry on the work of economic rehabilitation in a manner that will uphold British traditions.
Had Lang solely honed his rhetorical fire on a Conservative party so soulless that they didn't even bother to include any ideology in their name, he could have helped Scullin bulldoze that hostile Senate in the upcoming election. Instead, Lang ensured that his policy achievements came to an abrupt end in 1932. When Bob Santamaria later led a huge Catholic exodus away from the party, a bishop once said these wise words to him. Do you people really believe that you could do what even Jack Lang couldn't? I think there's a couple of politicians that could heed the same advice today. This video right here covers the 1955 split, but the think tank can make you a master of it.